Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people. Hey there guys, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today we are elaborating a little bit more on last week's episode, and we are going to be talking about preserving harvests from the garden. But before we get into that, why don't you tell me about your week?
This week was a lot. And it wasn't even because of homesteading. I mean, I'm still in the thick of the busy season with the garden. I'm so close to having it buttoned up. From planting and mulching and all that good stuff. But I actually spent most of the week in Colorado for work. And so this week was getting ready to go on that trip, going on that trip, and then coming back and catching up on all the things. And my flights, both there and back, got messed up. And so just the whole thing was so stressful, and I spent more time traveling than I actually spent time there. So it reminded me why I do not fly connecting flights. And it put me off of flying for a while.
It reminded you why you don't leave your homestead?
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't a leisurely vacation. It was for work. I work with people who mostly live out in Colorado, and it had been a couple years since I had shown my face in person, and it was just kind of time for me to do that. But now I get to say, nope, I went out recently. I'm not doing it again. It was a terrible experience, and I'm going to use this as an excuse to get myself out of future potential in-person Colorado work commitments, because oh my gosh, I'm going to be my nervous system is going to be recovering from that for probably a month, just because there's so many things when you already have a tight schedule that when you're gone for that long, it takes a long time to catch up.
Yeah, I would definitely be like, you can call me again in like 3 years, but don't talk to me about traveling until then. No thanks. Did Chrissy stay longer then to watch the animals with your flights?
Yes, so Chrissy stayed at the house and took care of everything. And I had to text her and say, hey, I'm stuck in Colorado. Can you stay another night? Because it took me from 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time Saturday morning until I think 1 Eastern Time Sunday to get home. So it took me a day and a half to get home. I was in airports and very sleep deprived. I'm actually still dizzy from that, which is new. I can't figure out if it's because I'm just old now and being sleep deprived like that just does things to my brain, or what's going on with that. But yeah, Chrissy was understanding and was able to stay another night. But I think she was kind of sick of watching everybody by then, and I think she was definitely sick of my 3 house pets at that point, because they need a lot of attention.
Oh, speaking of that, are there any updates on Athena and her sheepdogness?
No, the only update is that she has started to really like to smell something that's on my neighbor's property. So she has been crossing the road, which is terrifying and annoying. And she's a Great Pyrenees. She's a livestock guardian dog. And one of the things that they're known for is they do what they want. You know, you can teach them basic obedience, but at the end of the day, they were bred to have good critical thinking because they need to do that when they're out guarding animals. And so if you tell them to do something they don't want to do, they just kind of look at you and say, sucks.
Can you get like a GPS fence for her, like with a collar? Or just put her up in the pasture?
And I'm thinking about it, but it's just another thing to buy. And especially after spending money traveling, I'm just not eager to do anything like that. So we're working on positive and negative reinforcements. If she goes across the street, she has to go in the house, which she hates. So I'm going to see how that works. I did manage to get one homestead thing done, though, and that was plant my dahlias, which I was very excited about. So I pre-sprouted them inside because if I don't do that, the grasshoppers annihilate them. So I put them out in one of my raised beds, and then I took cuttings from some of the extra sprouts. So if it has more than one sprout, I'll take that as a cutting, and I'll try to root that independently. So I have the bulbs sitting outside, and then I have some cuttings I'm trying to root still inside. But that felt good. That felt really, really nice to get those out because those are my favorite flower. I absolutely love them. I have a ton of them, and I'm excited to see how they do.
I have all my dahlias in grow bags right now. I need to get them in the ground still, but they've all sprouted. So the ones I saved from last year and left on my laundry room floor for the entire winter resprouted.
What about you? What were you up to this week?
We made mead. We've been saying we're going to make mead since March of 2023, and we finally did it this past week. And we made 5 gallons, I believe, of different flavors. And we did 3 of them with like actually adding yeast to them. And we did 2 of them with a natural fermentation where you just add organic raisins and some lemon juice. And they're all doing really well. One of them exploded all over our ceiling overnight because we added like the yeast nutrient to the yeast, which is supposed to like make it, go crazy. And we should have waited a few days to do that because the ginger one got real rowdy. And then we had strawberry and ginger, basically jam, like exploded all over our entire ceiling and wall and drip behind the counter because that counter is just like set against the wall. It's not actually installed. And yeah, so that was fun to clean up. I'm excited to try those. They should be done in the next couple weeks, at least the yeasted ones. We picked our first blueberries ever here, which is really cool. They're the best blueberries I have ever tasted. I am not like a huge blueberry fan usually because they're kind of sour for me. I have such a big sweet tooth that literally like blueberries are sour to me, even if they're perfectly fine. And these are so sweet and so delicious. I was like, I want to eat all of these. I pretty much just spent every moment I can getting outside since it's finally stopped raining, like every day, and planting things. I'm really chugging along with the planting process finally. I feel like I'm getting caught up. And we've been eating our first like fresh from the garden homestead meals finally. The last like 3 or 4 nights we've had a homemade duck egg pasta with garlic scape and carrot top pesto, veggies from our garden, so carrots and baby potatoes, and we had 1 squash. There was 1 little zephyr squash that was ready. So that's pretty much it. I've just been kind of trying to survive. Like, there are so many things that need to be done. And I'm sure I've done a million other things, but those are the ones that stick out in my brain for this week.
I'm curious because you're going into your 2nd year on the homestead. How does this year, this time, compare to last year, this time?
It's interesting, and it's hard to compare it because last year, the first week of June, I quit my job.
Mm-hmm.
This year, a month and a half ago, I started working full-time hours, like set hours again. So last year at this time, I like instantly got not like full freedom, but I wasn't working set hours. I could work whenever I wanted. So I could do garden stuff during the day. Now I have to work during the day. The last couple weeks have felt a lot harder than they did last year trying to get the garden in. Last year, I was struggling more in May than I was in June. But this year, I feel like I'm feeling more behind now that it's June. So it's just kind of switched, but like actually getting things in the ground is easier. It's because I'm not having to prep the beds as much. I still feel really behind, if that makes any sense. It's a whole lot of chaos. The meal that I've been making the last few days, we've been pulling those out of our carrot and potato beds, but a lot of those things are actually ready. Like every single bit of them is ready to get pulled up. So I'm going to have to preserve things like now, like today and tomorrow and the rest of this week and for the rest of the summer. So yeah, let's get into talking about preserving.
Whether you intentionally grow more than you can possibly eat as it's coming in fresh from your garden, like Mickayla and I do, or whether you are just finding yourself with an overload of squash or tomatoes or whatever else you have, and you're looking to dip your toe in to preservation for the first time, there's a lot of different reasons that you would look to do that. Because we're homesteaders, we have been planning this for at least 6 months of how we can pull as much as we can from our gardens so that we can eat as much as we can from our own stores without having to go to the grocery store. And that's not where everyone's at, and that's totally okay. And you don't have to be a homesteader to look at doing some of these things.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the last episode, I am actively trying to eat things more fresh this year than I did last year. And I think that is almost harder to do than preserving, is actually like timing things where you're pulling stuff fresh and being able to consistently eat off of it and make meals out of that. So if you're in that phase, props to you, because that's not easy either. We are going to give it a little disclaimer for this episode, though. Neither of us are experts with this topic as far as like the safety and whatnot of preserving goes, especially with canning. I've been canning for 3 years. I don't know, Sage, how long you have?
2.
So yeah, we're confident in us doing it for ourselves, but we aren't experts with it at all. So we aren't going to give you specific canning recipes for legal reasons, I guess, for safety reasons, but we are going to provide you with some resources. And they're resources that I use, so I'm referencing these things when I'm canning. So as long as you follow them, you'll be making similar things to what we are making.
Whether you're just getting started with food preservation or maybe you've been doing this for a long time, we all have some pretty common things that we see come up. I know canned tomatoes is one of the main things that I do. Pickles, jams, and jellies, and also dried herbs are probably the most popular foods to preserve.
Something else that's pretty common to preserve, I think, is salsa. And then I also do just a lot of canned fruit in general that you could use for like pie fillings and stuff, or yogurt or whatever. So I think there's a lot of versatility in it, no matter what you eat on a regular basis. Just like there's a lot of versatility in the types of food you can preserve, there is also a lot of versatility in the methods that you can preserve them. So we're going to kind of go through all of the methods that we either use or they're pretty common, and we're going to try and go through them in a way that is the most accessible with like the least amount of tools or space.
So the first one that we're going to talk about is curing. And you can't do this with all food. This is generally like your root vegetables and pumpkins, things like potatoes, garlic, onions, yams, any sort of winter squash. And generally, curing these foods will make them good to store for up to a year. It kind of depends on how ideal your storage conditions are. I know my potatoes start growing eyes when it starts warming up outside, so I can get, maybe 6 to 8 months out of them. Same thing with a lot of my pumpkins this year. They started to kind of go bad when it started to warm up, but I have a decent amount of butternut squash that's still good to eat.
Where do you store your potatoes?
I just put them in a box in the corner of my kitchen because that's the best I can do.
Do you ever have any that like get rotten?
I had some that had just kind of tiny bug holes that I didn't necessarily notice when I went to store them. So anything that had cuts in it or that had large bug holes, I tried to set those aside and eat those first. Mm-hmm. But, just inherently, some slipped through, and so there were parts of them that I had to, cut out, but it wasn't anything significant. And I also went through them relatively quickly.
So that's something we should probably mention is if you are curing and storing veggies like that, you're going to want to probably once every couple weeks like sift through them and look at them and make sure that none of them are rotting, because if one is rotting and you leave it in there, the gases that it puts off will make the other ones rot a lot faster. So that's probably like a negative of this method, but otherwise it's really hands off. You just kind of have to like peek at them, and you usually can smell if something is going bad, especially with potatoes.
Right. And so I know that the curing process for the winter squashes, pumpkins, and then the yams is you set them somewhere. I set them on a shelf. It's the shelf that I use for seedling starting as well, because that room stays warm. And for those things, you want it to be warm when their skin is curing. That's what's actually curing, is the outer layer on them. But for things like potatoes and onion and garlic, at least the way I do it, is I set them out. I don't worry about them necessarily needing to be warm. It's just airflow. Wanting them to sit, again, not touching each other so that the skin can kind of, I don't know, harden, I guess, can get a little thicker and can act as a protective wrap around it for longer term storage.
With like the garlic and onions, the airflow is a huge deal. I'm actually planning to put them in our basement on chicken wire this year. I did them on lattice, like porch lattice last year out in our carport, and we don't have the room for that in the carport this year. But we get so much rain and there's so much humidity here that some of them even molded a little bit on the outside last year because of the humidity. So we're going to put a fan on them this year. Leaving the leaves, like leaving the full stalks on them, helps them dry out faster with onions and garlic specifically, because the leaves draw the moisture out away from the bulb, just as another little tip.
I really like curing because obviously these things are more or less shelf stable. They don't need to go into a fridge. They don't need to go into a freezer. If you have something that would act like a root cellar, that would be a great place to store them. And so I appreciate this because, my temperature regulated space is limited. And so anything that can sit out and that I don't have to worry about too much is a big deal to me.
I really like it because even if I'm going to have to preserve it at some point, it gives me such a long buffer. Like if I can cure it and let it sit in the kitchen or wherever it is for 6 months, and then it starts to go bad and I have to deal with it, it's not the middle of summer when I'm trying to deal with everything else. So I can mince all my garlic up when it starts to go bad in March or whatever, and I can still use it at that point. It's not a waste. The next method of preservation that we're going to talk about is fermented food. And I guess this would be like naturally pickled things, if you aren't really sure what fermented means. So you can ferment all sorts of things. Honestly, like I can think of so many. A lot of people do like sauerkraut, cabbages, kimchi, things like that. You could ferment carrots. You could do cucumber, like actual real pickles. And then there's also the other side of things where we're talking about like hard ciders, mead, things like that, alcoholic ferments. So depending on what you're fermenting, whether it's the food or apples into cider or honey into mead or something else into wine, it's going to last different periods of time. The alcohol will age and sometimes get better.
I have very little experience with the fermented straight foods side of thing. I've been wanting to make kimchi for a while, but I haven't quite nailed down how to make Napa cabbage, so I'm not there yet. But I have been making wine for several years now. Maybe or maybe not before I actually turn 21. But if you're talking about wine, that can store for years because of all the sanitation that happens in that process, and then it's isolated in a bottle and stored. That can be good for a really long time, whereas things like kimchi or sauerkraut, that kind of stuff is what you're going to want to eat within a few months. Maybe you can stretch it up to 6 months, but for food safety, I wouldn't really push it past that. I really like fermented foods because it's kind of a value add. You process it into something that's a little bit different. Eating a head of Napa cabbage is different than eating kimchi, and there's a lot of other ingredients and time that goes into that, but it just adds variety, especially when you're trying to eat from your garden. It's a new flavor profile, and that's part of why fermenting is cool, because it draws out flavors that you really can't get any other way. But some of the drawbacks are, if you're not sterilizing or cleaning your jars or whatever you're fermenting in beforehand, it can kind of twist the flavor to something that's not great. I had that happen with some apple scrap vinegar I tried to make that I didn't ultimately get to use because I was tired and I didn't clean my containers well enough.
Another good thing about it is, well, at least in the food side, I don't know necessarily about the alcohol side, but the bacteria in it is really good to be consuming, and it kind of like balances out your gut, and it's just good for your gut health in general.
Yeah, I think it's both a prebiotic and a probiotic, right? It's both of them.
Yeah, and I think that there's like a lot of fermented food. I don't know if it's just because of the foods that typically get fermented, but I know it's like high in antioxidants and stuff usually too. So with the fermented alcohols, usually you can store those after they're done fermenting, and they can be shelf stable. But with the food, that's something that you're going to have to make room for in your fridge. So that is kind of a negative about that too, because a lot of the times you're doing these things in either quart or half-gallon jars or like a bigger crock, and you have to find space for it in a fridge or get an extra fridge. My whole half of my top shelf in the fridge is filled with pickled things right now.
Next step is drying or dehydrating. This also doesn't really take a fancy piece of equipment. You can air dry things if you want to. You can use your oven on a really low setting, or if you do want to go ahead and get the equipment just to make your life a little easier, they do have lower cost dehydrators. I think mine was like $20 and I got it, goodness gracious, probably longer ago than I want to admit, but I'm going to call it like 5 years. But you can also get fancy dehydrators as well. It's just whatever you're looking for. So you have options. And if you dehydrate foods, generally they're going to be good for up to a year. They can last longer, but I would start to worry about things molding, especially because I live in the Southeast and it is humid, and no matter how much I try, that moisture just ends up getting in there. Some common things to be dried would be herbs and peppers. I dry pretty much all of my seasoning peppers, and if I wanted to and had the time, I could make that into a paprika blend, but I usually just leave them whole and then grind them up right before I'm going to put them in my food. Another thing that I do is I process some of my tomatoes into quote unquote sun-dried tomatoes. They're not really sun-dried tomatoes. They are oven-dried tomatoes, but that's something I absolutely love to have in the pantry and throw in. It's a little bit different than all of the other canned tomatoes that I have, and it adds a different texture element too. Sometimes when you're preserving food and you're talking about the methods we're going to get into after this, you do kind of lose the infrastructure of the food itself. It all just kind of becomes a little bit mushy because it's either frozen or cooked to some extent.
My favorite thing to dry using our dehydrator is the herbs that I use for tea. So like mints and lemon balms and pineapple sage and things like that. That's probably what I use our dehydrator most for. Sometimes I'll use it to dry fruit into like fruit leather if I want a little snack. That's really yummy too. That takes forever though. That's definitely a time heavy preservation method.
Typically, if I'm dehydrating something, I'm setting it up to run overnight. So I'll set it up before I go to bed and I'll check it in the morning. My dehydrator is kind of loud and it does generate heat. And because I don't have central AC, I try to do those things that generate heat at night. And so it's easy to let it run for, 8, 10, 12 hours in that period of time. And then I don't have to hear it whirring in the background all day, slowly driving me just like a little bit crazy.
I put mine outside. I plug it in outside or the laundry room because then I can't hear it. Then it doesn't add heat to my house. And then I can't smell whatever is going on in there. Because if I'm drying like green onions stink up the house a lot when they're dehydrating. It doesn't smell like you're cooking onions. It just smells like stale onion. I don't know. It's a weird scent and I don't like it. So I just usually put it outside.
I personally like dehydrating because although it takes a long time, it's kind of almost set it and forget it for me. So I don't have to constantly manage it in the way that I would if I, would have to set a timer if I'm canning something, for example. So I appreciate that aspect of it. And I also really appreciate that the end result is shelf stable. So I don't have to, again, make room in the freezer or the fridge for it, which is a big deal for me. There's no energy involved in storing it after it's dried. And yeah, my real estate in the fridge, in the freezer is very limited.
I just remembered one of my other favorite things to dehydrate is citrus, like grapefruit and oranges and lemons, like really thin slices of those, because then I can put them in like simmer pots in the winter or in tea or give them away as part of like a little gift in the wintertime. Another thing that's kind of a negative about dehydrating is you kind of have to do it in small batches depending on what method you're using. If you're air drying things, you can probably just pile them all up on the screen, but you're going to have to kind of separate things out so that they get the airflow that they need. If you're doing in the oven, you'll probably have a little bit more space, but you'll need to stir things around so that the bottoms are getting the airflow. And in a dehydrator, I don't know what do you have one of the round ones, Sage? Like the little round ones?
I do. Yeah.
I've never used one of those, but in mine, it's like the rectangle kind with the trays. And so everything has like full airflow because they're like metal grates, like a cooling rack, basically. It doesn't fit a ton vertically, so you kind of have to lay things really flat, but that gets really good airflow in there. So you do kind of have to do smaller batches of stuff. When I'm pulling massive amounts of mint and lemon balm out of the garden or green onions, it does take a couple of rounds usually because I can't fit it all in there. They take up a lot of space. Okay, moving on to the next preservation method, freezing. This is probably one of the most common and probably the easiest one. You can pretty much freeze anything. I feel like you can toss anything in a bag, toss it in the freezer, and it's good to go. Depending on which type of bag you're going to put it in or what storage method you're using, it will last for about a year. It might start to get freezer burnt depending on, if you're just putting it in like a storage baggie in the freezer, you might see freezer burn before the year mark if you're not using it soon enough. If you're using like actual freezer bags or vacuum sealing things, that's gonna help that freezer burn to stay away for a little bit longer. Yeah, you can freeze really anything. I feel like this is probably one of the most popular ones for meat specifically, and then I personally use it for all sorts of veggies. Like we froze a lot of edamame last year, a lot of corn on the cob to pull out. Hopefully this year we'll do green beans. I did a lot of snap peas last year. What do you like to store in the freezer?
So because I personally don't pressure can, and we'll get to that later, I freeze anything that I can't, dehydrate or cure or anything else that we talked about. So anything that doesn't fit in a different category, I will freeze. So that tends to be squash, green beans, I'll freeze. My pesto batches, I'll freeze. Pasta, I'll freeze. I definitely freeze all of my chickens that I harvest. And then anything, any tomatoes that I will, get to later, but maybe I don't have the time right now, or maybe I just don't have enough to make like a really big batch yet. Sometimes I'll also throw those in the freezer. I don't like to do that though, because I do feel like it changes the taste just a little bit, especially for things like tomatoes.
I froze my tomatoes last year temporarily. That was the most efficient way to do things for me. I will definitely do that again this year. So yeah, when it comes to things like trying to get tomatoes in the oven, not in the oven, in the freezer for sauce later, it's so easy to just like wash them, cut them, like score them. I didn't even score them last year. Toss them in a bag and throw them in the freezer. Some things you have to blanch first if you want the best texture out of them. Like carrots, we're going to do that for pretty much any veggie. I feel like you should usually blanch it first. I can't think of any off the top of my head that you wouldn't.
Specifically, I do that because it also helps preserve the nutrition better if you blanch it. So you dunk it in hot water briefly, you take it from the hot water to an ice bath so that it stops cooking very quickly. And then once it's cool, then you can pull it out. You can freeze it without blanching it, but yeah, it's a texture thing, and also it just won't be as nutritious when you do eventually get to eating it.
Yeah, and the time that you blanch it depends on the veggie. So you'll have to look that up if that's something that's new to you. Just Google how many minutes to do it. Sometimes it's 30 seconds, sometimes it's like 2 minutes. Just depends on what you're trying to blanch.
So really the only drawback to freezing for me is that, like I said before, for some foods, I personally feel like it can change the flavor a little bit. It definitely will change the texture. But even though I have my freezer in my kitchen and I have a chest freezer, I just don't have that much freezer space because my chest freezer is usually full of poultry. So, when it's September and I've done 2 batches of meat birds and a bunch of produce come out of my garden for the year, I don't have anywhere else to put it. So even though it's convenient, even though it's fast, I tend to not rely on that as a go-to.
I feel like this is a good opportunity to say this. We post visuals and reels and stuff with each episode. So I am going to try and remember to include a picture of my saggy, sad tomatoes from last year that I pulled out of the freezer because no one warned me that all of the liquid would drain out of them. It's the best way to get the liquid out of them. Nobody warned me that they would just be like sad little lumps when they thawed, and it was so funny. So I will definitely add that to those pictures because that made me laugh a lot.
Next, we're going to talk about canning. There are 2 different distinct methods for canning. So the first one is water bath canning, which does require, you can do steam canning as well. That's a special piece of equipment. I haven't messed with that, but it's the same principle. Water bath canning you can do in just a large stock pot. They do sell pots specifically for water bath canning, and I did buy one of those. It was like $30, I think, and it is by far the largest pot that I have. But if you have a large stock pot and you have something to hold the cans off of the very bottom while you're heating it, there's no reason that you can't use that. So for water bath canning, generally you want to eat that food within a year. It's not necessarily going to be unsafe for consumption past that point, but it's going to start to degrade in terms of flavor and nutrition after that. So the goal is 1 year, but it's not necessarily hard stop that it just goes bad after that. And you can water bath can acidic foods specifically. So these are things like tomatoes, anything pickled that has vinegar added to it. This is going to be your jams and jellies. And if the food is not already naturally acidic enough to qualify for that, you can add acidic additives to it. So that would be things like lemon juice, vinegar, or citric acid in order to lower the pH to a level that it is safe to water bath can it.
I have never actually tried this, but if you are super concerned about the acidity, there are ways to test the acidity like while you're canning things. I don't necessarily know what they are like exactly because I've never used them, but I think that there's like test strips and stuff or like test things that you can use to test the acidity to make sure that it's going to be safe to water bath can. But I personally have never worried about it that much. I just make sure that I use store-bought vinegar to add to that kind of stuff because store-bought vinegar is going to be a very specific, I think it's 5% specific acidity. And if you make like your own apple cider vinegar, you can again test that to make sure it's that percentage, or you just don't know if it's actually going to reach that point.
Right, yeah, they do make test strips. They're pretty cheap. They're pretty easily accessible. So if you're new to it, if you're nervous, go ahead and try that. I know that when I started canning, I was so nervous to do this because no matter how much I researched, right, I was like, but what about botulism? Like, it doesn't smell like anything. It doesn't look like anything. Oh my gosh. And so something that really helped me get over that hurdle was understanding that, this is just pre-cooking my food. I'm still going to take those canned tomatoes. I'm still going to take whatever and then further turn it into something else, like a tomato sauce. And so if you are just dipping your toe in, if you are nervous, maybe start with foods that you're going to cook again before you ultimately eat it, because I'm not going to say specific values and specific numbers, again, for legal reasons, but look up what it would take to kill anything that could be in there. It's not very long, especially when you're cooking with a lid on. So if you're super nervous, look into that. But if you're following recipes from reputable sources, you should be okay.
Yeah. And you kind of learn and get a lot more comfortable with it as you do it. And in my experience, that happens very quickly. Like, I was scared the first couple times I did it, more because I just didn't know the process very well, not because I was scared about giving myself botulism. I was just like, am I going to mess this up where, like, I'm going to just accidentally dump, like, the jars are going to break, or, like, I'm going to dump all of this, have to dump all this food, and it's not going to work. And, yeah, I got confident with it really quickly, so it just takes a few times practicing, and you really like get comfortable with the process, and you kind of can look at recipes and know like what you need to do.
One thing I will say is if you are relying on lemon juice or homemade vinegar to acidify your food, know that that is not necessarily going to, how do I phrase this, reliably change the pH per volume in the same way that vinegar would. So if you're buying store-bought vinegar that is established at 5%, you know exactly, how much it's going to influence the pH. When you're dealing with lemons, the lemon that you have in your right hand could make it a lot more acidic than the lemon you have in your left hand, just because not all lemons are created equal. So you can either choose to use store-bought lemon juice, which that is more homogeneous, that is more predictable, or you can rely on things like vinegar or citric acid. I like to use citric acid because I don't think it changes the taste. I add a little bit of citric acid even to all my tomatoes, even though the tomatoes are probably acidic enough as is. I don't feel like that's an unhealthy food additive for me. It just gives me that peace of mind when I'm canning things that, okay, I know this is good.
My favorite thing about water bath canning, or just canning in general, is that the food is shelf stable. Like, I made Taylor build me shelves specifically to store all of this food because I didn't have anywhere else to put it because I made so much. I don't have to keep it in my freezer. I don't have to keep it in my fridge, and it looks so pretty on that side of my kitchen. That's probably honestly my favorite part about it, not even the shelf stable part. It just adds like the homestead aesthetic to my kitchen, and it makes it feel cozy, and I really like that.
I will say that to some extent I do dread canning especially tomatoes, because it makes the kitchen so hot. I have to bring that whole giant pot of water to a rolling boil, and then I have to process those tomatoes for like 45 minutes-ish. Let that pot boil for that long in August when the house is already like 78 degrees, and it's kind of brutal. And if I had AC, it wouldn't be the big of a deal, but I don't.
You could, if you really wanted to, you could use a crock pot or a roaster oven, and that kind of helps a little bit. I keep mine on low for almost the entire day, simmering, and it doesn't heat up too much. It's the canning. The canning process is what heats the house up for me, because that pot is so massive.
Also true. And you can get like a camping stove set up to do it outside if it's truly a concern. But I'm trying to not buy more things, so I'll deal with the hothouse before I buy another thing.
Canning jars are also really expensive. They've gotten significantly more expensive in the last couple of years, like way more. I think they were on sale yesterday for like $18. And they were $16, $15 last year, and previously they were $12. So that's a bummer. Azure Standard has been a little bit cheaper, but it's getting expensive.
It's interesting because the more expensive jars aren't always the bigger ones. They're often, the smaller, the half pint, or the ones that are even smaller than that. Those tend to be even more expensive than the pint and the quart jars in my experience, which I don't understand.
What's also really interesting is if you want wide mouth jars, those are more expensive usually. So, and they have different
I guess it's a little bit more material.
Yeah, I mean, they're the same volume though. Like, there's not as much neck.
I don't know.
If you want like the smooth-sided jars with less like patterns on them, sometimes those are more expensive. It's the whole thing.
Yeah. But the good part of those is that the glass at least is basically infinitely reusable. I guess if you were to use them for decades, the extreme heating and cooling might get to them and they might eventually start to crack. But they are solid. They are solidly built, and the glass portions you can reuse. I do buy new lids every year, so that is a cost, but it's nothing compared to buying new jars every year.
The only time I've ever broken a mason jar is when I put cold mason jars full of food, or like not heated, into hot water. That will break your jars, the temperature difference. But otherwise, they're solid. I think they're pretty sturdy. Last year, I got a pack of jars with every grocery order, or every time we went and got groceries, starting in January, to try and stock up for the year. And I need to get more this year. Like, I thought I was going to be good, but I'm not. I need more. The other side of canning is pressure canning, and that is going to be something you use with low acidity, like your standard vegetables. So if you're trying to can carrots or potatoes or beans or meat or a lot of preserved like meal food, so if you're trying to do chicken noodle soup or a broth or something, those are all things that you're going to want to pressure can. Sort of like water bath canning, those are going to be good for about a year. They start to lose their taste and nutrition after about a year. That doesn't mean that you can't eat them. They're not bad necessarily, but you do kind of want to use them up on like a yearly cycle. I think Ball actually guarantees their lids to seal for 18 months.
That brings up a good canning question.
Okay.
If you don't mind me interrupting you.
Go for it.
Actually, two questions. One, do you store your jars with or without the ring on? And two, how often do you deal with failed seals?
Okay, so for the first question, when I take my jars out of the canner, I let them sit on the table for at least 24 hours to cool down and just do their thing, make sure they're sealed. Then I take the rings off. I pick each jar up by the lid to make sure that it's sealed, because if it can pick up the jar, then it pretty much like guaranteed is sealed fully if it's not coming off when you pick up the jar with it. And then I wash, like fully soap, water, lukewarm water, wash all of my jars, because stuff leaks out sometimes. It like seeps out through the lid while they're canning, and then they can get sticky. And I just don't like the thought of potential mold being on the outside of my jars and being like near them. And so I store them washed with the rings off, and I try not to stack them. I don't stack any of my bigger jars, because that can cause your, like it can cause a false seal. If they accidentally unseal, then you won't know because it's like pushed down. Some of my like 4-ounce jars I do have stacked on that shelf because I just ran out of room, and those things aren't very heavy at all. I try not to if I don't have to, though. And then what was your second question?
How often do you deal with false seals? So you'll go through the whole process and then you'll go to store it and then realize that it just didn't seal. Or you pick it up off the shelf and find that it unsealed.
I think probably the first time that I canned, like a quarter of them didn't seal because I didn't do it correctly. I didn't twist the lid down the right amount. Every time since then, total, I've probably had like maybe 5 jars ever not seal after that. 5 to 10. I can't remember. I've canned so many things. Off the shelf, like pulling things off the shelf later on, maybe 3 things have ever just like unsealed themselves. I can think of 3. One was an apple pie jar. One was peaches. And I don't remember what the other one was, but yeah, I've had 3 jars unseal. They were all quart jars, and they were in different locations.
I've never pulled anything off the shelf and had it been unsealed, which at first I was like, am I just not noticing? But when I go to open something, I can't pry it off with my hands. No. I have to get a can opener, and I'm like, okay, I feel good about that. I also don't can as much as you, and so just the statistical probability, of what you've encountered versus what I've encountered, I've just done it less. And as far as directly, after processing it, I've had 1 or 2, but nothing substantial. I think just because I'm kind of newer to it, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna soak it in hot water before I try to put it on, and I'm gonna do the vinegar, and I'm gonna make sure that it screws on like just right. So I think I'm a little overbearing, call it, with it, and so maybe that's why.
I don't usually put my food into hot jars. I have like the lazy canning method of I don't have enough time to do all of this in one day, like prepare the food, put it in jars, and can it. So I usually end up canning things over like a 3-day period where I have to keep them in the fridge overnight. So I'm usually putting like hot food into like room temperature jars, and then I let that like cool down for a little bit, put it in my fridge, can a batch the next day. But I start with cold water in the canner and heat it up all together, because that's just how my lifestyle is right now. But I am very specific about how much I tighten the jars now, and doing the vinegar and wiping the rims and everything. Like, I am very specific about that. I don't soak my lids. Like, I don't heat the lids up first. You're not supposed to do that anymore with the ball lids anyway. It says on there you're not supposed to do that. When did that happen? It's whatever they switch to like the Sure Seal label. You don't have to heat them up anymore. I don't know.
You don't have to, or it's bad to? Because those are 2 different things.
I think you can, but you don't need to. And I've never had an issue with it. That's just one less pot that I need boiling, so I don't do it. Saves me some time. I don't have to deal with hot lids. We're good. Anything that you can, whether it's pressure or water bath, is going to be shelf stable. It should be shelf stable for about a year or longer. I really like the pressure canner, and I wish I would have gotten that first, because you can use the pressure canner as a water bath canner, and you don't need 2 at that point. You just don't put the seal on. So if you are somebody who is trying to get into canning and you want to do both, I would just save up and get the pressure canner. If you plan to do both eventually anyway, it will save you $35. I was really scared the first time I canned corn, which was the pressure canner. That's the first thing I ever pressure canned. I was so scared. We lived with our friend and I thought I was going to blow his house up. I didn't. It all worked out well and I can confidently pressure can now. The only thing with pressure canning is I make sure I'm in the room the whole time it's happening, which is kind of annoying. Water bath, I'll walk away. But you kind of have to keep an eye on the pressure canner a little bit more. And I have like a specific little tool. It's like a weight that like the steam pushes it. So it like kind of goes tick tock like the clock does, or like a manual clock does. And so you have that like rhythm that you can hear and you can pay attention to other things. That is super helpful. The canners don't come with that though. You have to buy that separately. It's like $10 though.
Yeah, I have never pressure canned, and partially it's an intimidation thing. It's not something I grew up with. It's not something that I fully know how to do. And yes, I could figure it out if I was really determined to. But, the foods that I would pressure can, I would honestly rather freeze because it becomes a texture thing for me. Green beans, for example. If I blanch them and freeze them, then I can still have them, for lack of a better word, I guess, still kind of al dente, because I don't like them cooked really far, which is what would happen if I were to pressure can them. So there's just nothing that I've come across yet that I've said, oh, I wish I could pressure can that.
No, it's definitely a texture thing. I prefer canned corn, like home canned corn and home canned peas, to the flavor of frozen ones. So I would rather can them. But I totally understand. Like he does not like canned green beans. He likes frozen green beans. So I don't can green beans. I might this year for soup or something, but yeah, it's texture based. I haven't had to do this yet, but another thing about the pressure canner is if you're using it to actually pressure can and you're using the seal that comes in the cheaper models, I think the All-American one that's like $500 now doesn't have a seal, but the Presto and like other kinds, I think I have the Presto. Those have a rubber gasket that you need to maintain and replace every so often because they kind of get cracked and then it won't seal correctly. I have had it for 3 years and I haven't needed to do that yet, but I do have an extra gasket on hand for when that does happen.
Moving on from canning, let's talk about freeze drying. This does require investing in an expensive piece of equipment, but your food is going to stay good for like a decade or multiple decades if you're able to freeze dry it and store it in specific containers. So I get it. I don't have a freeze dryer. I don't know if I'll ever get to the point that I do have a freeze dryer, but I think it's really cool because this is another method where you can process almost anything. Some of the things that I saw that they don't recommend are really fatty meats, stuff like butter, mayonnaise, and things in that realm. But there are so many things you can preserve by freeze drying them. It's kind of mind blowing. And the biggest perk of it is that it's shelf stable for so long. So you can build up a store of things and you don't have to worry about, oh, what was preserved last year versus what was preserved this year. You can keep it for a really long time before you have to start worrying about that. The other thing about it is you can almost do like whole meals of things. I've seen people prepare soup and freeze dry it. I know eggs is a really popular one. Yeah, it's almost easier to talk about what you can't do with it than what you can.
The length of time that things are going to be good for, it really depends on how you store them. If you just store them in a jar with an oxygen absorber, they're not going to last super long, especially if you're opening that jar like repeatedly. But the things that are going to store for like 10 to 20 whatever years, those are going to be in Mylar, like in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers. Things that you're not opening consistently. The air getting into them is what makes freeze-dried food go bad.
They're, like we talked about, they're very expensive. You can only do smaller batches at a time, similar to the dehydrator. There are different sizes, but even between the sizes, it's not a huge difference. You're limited to the capacity of the machine, and then it takes a while. So depends on what you're freeze drying, but if you're freeze drying something that's, for example, in really big pieces and has really high water content, it's going to take a while. I know some people will go ahead and pre-freeze some of the things that they're going to freeze dry just because it takes less time in the freeze dryer itself if you give it that head start.
I personally would love a freeze dryer in the future. I don't know if it's ever going to be like practical for us. I think it would help me cut down on my like sugary snack consumption because I could freeze dry my own fruits and stuff. I don't like dehydrated fruits unless it's like fruit leather. But I love like freeze-dried apples and stuff are so good, but they're so expensive at the store. So honestly, it might be worth it just for that for me. Another negative thing about the freeze dryer though is not only is it expensive to invest in initially, but it costs like a few dollars in energy costs every time you use it. So you kind of have to weigh the costs. Like if you're constantly using it and your goal is to make shelf-stable food for like emergency situations, or if you go hiking often and you like camping and you want to make meals, like that might be worth it for you. And there are ways that you can pay it off. People will sell freeze-dried candy to pay them off in like a certain amount of time. Like people will start businesses for like 6 months only and sell freeze-dried candy to pay off their freeze dryer. That's super common. But yeah, they cost a lot of money for the investment and to run them as well.
Yeah, and you have to maintain them. I mean, I haven't looked into this too extensively because it's not in my budget right now. Laughable. But there is also, maintenance associated with it. There is some fluid that you have to change in it, almost similar to like how you would change your oil in your car. There's maintenance to it to keep that thing running the way it should.
Yeah, and it does add heat to your house, just like a dehydrator would, probably more. I think there's like a water, like it spills the water out the back, so you have to make sure that you have like a way to collect that and like check on it and everything. So it's something that's kind of hands-on.
I'm just gonna wait until you get one, and then I'll just come borrow it every once in a while.
That's fine.
Barter for things.
I mean, sounds good to me. I want one so I can freeze dry my own candy. The last preservation method we have on our list here is water glassing, and this is kind of specifically talking about eggs. We've talked about this in previous episodes, but it doesn't really fit into any of the other categories, so we thought we'd say it again just in case anybody's interested. Basically, you are putting clean eggs that haven't been washed, so you don't want any like poopy bits, no dirt, straw, or anything on them. Clean eggs, but you want the bloom on them still, into a jar. You mix water with, it's like food grade hydrated lime, so people call it pickling lime, and you just kind of whisk that together. And then the way that it works is the lime, it's that dusty substance, even though it's mixed into the water, it doesn't dissolve in the water, and so it fills the pores of the eggs and preserves them perfectly up to like 18 months or 2 years, I think is the amount of time that you'd want to use them in. So it's shelf stable. The yolks get runny the longer they're sitting in the solution. So they're going to be better for scrambled eggs or baking and things like that, not like a sunny side up egg or whatever. I have 3 jars of them. I moved one of them recently and one of the eggs cracked and I had to like dig them all out and put them back in there. So you do want to either like make sure they're in the spot they're going to stay. Sometimes they'll just crack anyway because they get a little bit too brittle. So you do want to keep an eye on them, kind of like you would with like cured things that we talked about earlier. But for the most part, it's really hands off.
So if you are looking for resources and recipes for canning specifically, we do have some places that we can point you to, since we're not going to give you any specific canning recipes. The Ball Blue Book is a really big one, and then so is the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. So they're two different things. The Ball Blue Book will tell you about the strategy of canning, and there are a few recipes, I think, in there, right? There's still a handful.
There's a lot.
Versus versus the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, which is a lot more recipe heavy. So if you're really going for the bulk of the recipes, you're going to want the Ball Complete book. So it's whatever you prefer. And then another good resource for you is going to be National Center for Home Food Preservation. And we will throw the link to that down below so that you can look there for all the safety guidelines that they provide. And also they have some recipes as well.
Yeah, just to throw it out there, I only have the Ball Blue book. It's a smaller book, and it has all the recipes that I need, but we looked it up before this episode started, or before we recorded, and they're the same price, and they have a lot of overlap, so I think you'd be good getting either one.
I don't actually have any literature that necessarily taught me how to can. Before I started canning, I basically Googled it and cross-referenced multiple sources to make sure somebody wasn't just making some things up, or to make sure that it wasn't an AI-generated article with bad information. So that's how I learned to can. I didn't, again, anything that I can knock off my list of stuff I need to buy is great. And I will probably eventually end up buying that book. But I just Google recipes and I make sure that it makes sense given my canning knowledge, and again, cross-referencing with other sources to make sure that it's safe. So whatever works best for you.
Yeah, I started with the book, and I only made recipes out of that book to start with. And now I have enough knowledge after 3 years of doing it that I feel comfortable Googling recipes like you do, and then kind of cross-referencing them, making sure the acidity is going to be right, that balance is going to be right. And that's what I was kind of talking about earlier with, like, your confidence will grow and you'll be able to, like, recognize what you need to have specifically for recipes to be able to work. I also think that Ball has free recipes on their website too. I don't know what they are. I know I've used a few, like strawberry jam's on there, canning corn might be on there. They definitely have some recipes on their website if you aren't interested in buying a book.
The pectin that I buy for jams and jellies also has recipes in it, partially so that you add the right amount of pectin and it actually becomes jam or a jelly instead of just a runny something. So that's another place that I get my recipes from, and I trust them. They have some liability if they give me a bad recipe.
I think this is the most anticipated part of this episode and all of our episodes.
I didn't realize that people were going to your videos asking for this basil oil recipe. And now I understand why you've said you need to give the people this recipe for so long. And the funny part is, I actually got this recipe from a friend and then I lost the recipe. So this is from my memory. And I tried it out last year. So I had it year before last, the actual written recipe. And then I was like, oh, shoot, I don't have that anymore. And I recreated it last year and it worked. So...
Sage's
I've
original
tried it. Yeah, I can't vouch for if it's the same as the original one, but it's a recipe and it's basil oil. So I'm going to give you two versions. The first version is shelf stable. It does involve handling hot oil, and it can just honestly be a little bit intimidating. So because of that, I'm also going to give you a second recipe, which is not shelf stable. It doesn't store for as long, and so it's not good for, bulk preserving things, but it doesn't involve, straining hot oil and all kinds of shenanigans, and it will still give you basil oil. So you choose which one you want, but this first one that I'm going to go through is shelf stable, and it's what I use to preserve my ungodly amounts of basil that I grow every year. It's really not complicated. It doesn't sound like much, but it's 250 grams of basil, which when I heard that, I was like, that sounds like nothing. But it's like a KitchenAid mixer bowl and a half, at least, of basil leaves. Like it's a big bunch of basil. And then it's going to be 4 cups of some neutral oil. I like to use olive oil. I do not use extra virgin olive oil for this because you're going to cook it. And that kind of defeats the purpose of the extra virgin olive oil. Just go ahead and use a sauteing olive oil or something that's not minimally processed, because we're going to process it anyway. So your first step is going to be to blend those two things for a very long time. I think the original recipe said until it starts steaming. And I was like, oh my gosh, my blender is not that hardy. I cannot do that. I will break my blender. So I just blend it for a really, really long time. Because of that, it'll start to warm up just because of all the energy being expended by the blender. So when it's warm and when the pieces are really itty bitty, then I say, okay, that's good enough for me. And then I will pour that into a pan on the stove. I prefer the bigger surface area because I think it helps cook off the water faster. If you don't have a pan with tall edges, you can use a pot. That's totally okay. Just depends on what you have. And the goal is to get that to a temperature where it's going to be simmering, but not boiling. But also you want to get it up to temperature as fast as you reasonably can. So I will preheat that pan before I pour it in there. Again, this is where the intimidating part of the recipe comes in, because pouring oil into a hot pan and then dealing with it is just a little bit dangerous, especially if you're not super familiar with the kitchen. So please be careful, guys. We're not liable if you hurt yourself making this recipe. But yeah, the goal is to keep that at a simmer, not a boil. And then you're going to keep that on medium-high heat until it stops bubbling. That's going to tell you that there's no moisture left in that oil anymore. The goal is to get all of the moisture out, because that is what's going to make it shelf stable. If for some reason you're not able to cook it until that point, it's still going to be basil oil, but it's not going to be shelf stable. So if you want it to be shelf stable, you have to take it to the point that it stops bubbling, that it stops reacting. After that, you can then strain it. So obviously it's still going to have basil pieces in it. I recommend putting something like a coffee filter, sitting that in a sieve, or you can do lots of layers of cheesecloth too. Depends on what works for you. And you're going to pour that oil through that strainer into a container underneath. Again, please be super, super careful. You're dealing with screaming hot oil. It's not a fun time if that goes sideways. And then once it's strained, you're going to let it sit there, let it cool, and ultimately put it into some sort of airtight container. I put mine in mason jars. I don't can it or anything thereafter. I just put it in those jars. And it's really cool because it's like bright green. And I almost have to put it into a white container to be able to see that, because if it goes in a mason jar, it's so dark and it's so basil infused that it's just kind of like black. But if you put it over a white backdrop, it's bright green from that basil.
How many batches of this do you make a year? Just one or more?
I make one batch because I have one really, really big harvest of basil, but I make a big batch. I think the first year I did it, I just did the one batch with the 4 cups of oil. And then last year I did a double batch, so that was 8 cups of oil. And I thought that I was going to run out, but I think it's actually going to be perfectly timed, although I have been rationing it, admittedly.
You should probably do 3.
Okay, so that's version number 1, and I'll throw all of this in the description. I just want to run through it with you guys. That's version number 1. That's going to be your shelf-stable version. That is what I do. If that sounds too intimidating to you, that's totally okay. Here's another version for you that doesn't involve as much hot oil. So it's going to be 2 parts basil leaves to 1 part olive oil. So, for example, 2 cups of basil leaves and 1 cup of olive oil. Make sure that you're packing those basil leaves tight, though, as you're measuring them. And what you're going to do is you're going to just briefly blanch those leaves in boiling water for like 20 seconds. They're going to turn bright green. After that, you're going to take them from that hot water and dunk them in an ice bath to make sure that they stop cooking. You're going to let them dry on a kitchen towel just for a few minutes. And then you're going to blend those 2 things together, those blanched basil leaves and the olive oil, and then you're just going to strain it, and then you're done. You don't have to heat the oil, you don't have to do anything crazy, but you do have to store that in the refrigerator and then use it within about a week. So those are 2 different versions for you. Again, we'll put those all in the description. You don't have to memorize what I'm saying to you, but I hope you guys try it out if you're interested.
I bet you could freeze that one, because you can freeze olive oil, like pesto, right? That would be a good way to store it.
You could definitely freeze that. Yeah. If you wanted to do a big batch of it to preserve your basil for the year, but you don't want to have a gallon of pesto, you could totally do a large batch of that or several batches of that and put it in the freezer if you have the space.
I kind of want to try this with my garlic scapes.
Interesting. I'm sure you could do that. Honestly, though, with garlic scapes, I would be totally okay with still having the chunks in there. I just blend it with some olive oil and call it good because I'm a garlic fiend, and that's a different issue.
Same. I have a lot of pesto. Like, I already make pesto, so I feel like it would be good with garlic scapes. Maybe I'll try it. Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.